The Zero's wings flashed silver against the Pacific sun as it screamed toward my Wildcat at 300 miles per hour. I had maybe 2 seconds to react, and in those 2 seconds, I could see the muzzle flashes from his machine guns painting deadly orange streaks across my canopy. My fighter shuddered as bullets punched through the fuselage behind me. The smell of cordite and hot metal filled the cockpit. "Scratch one more," I muttered through gritted teeth, pulling back on the stick with everything I had. The G-forces crushed me into my seat as my Grumman F4F Wildcat climbed nearly vertical, engine screaming at maximum power. Below me, the Zero pilot tried to follow, but his aircraft couldn't match the Wildcat's power in a straight climb. That was his mistake. My name is Lieutenant Jimmy O'Hare, and on June 4, 1942, I was one of 6 Wildcat pilots tasked with defending the most important naval fleet in American history during the Battle of Midway. What nobody told us that morning was that we'd be facing over 100 Japanese aircraft with ammunition running so low that every single bullet had to count. What they also didn't tell us was that the USS Yorktown, our home, our floating city of steel, was supposed to be at the bottom of the Pacific already. But Admiral Chester Nimitz had other plans, and so did we. 3 days earlier, Yorktown had limped into Pearl Harbor with a massive hole blown through her flight deck from the Battle of the Coral Sea. The shipyard engineers said she needed 3 months of repairs. Admiral Nimitz gave them 72 hours. 1,400 workers swarmed over that carrier like ants, welding steel plates, replacing twisted metal, and patching holes with whatever they could find. When we steamed out of Pearl Harbor on May 30th, you could still smell the fresh paint and hear the hammering of rivets being driven home. The Japanese thought they'd sunk Yorktown at Coral Sea. Their intelligence reports confirmed it. Admiral Yamamoto's entire battle plan for Midway was based on facing only 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. The sudden appearance of a third carrier would shatter their carefully orchestrated attack like glass. But first, we had to survive long enough to spring the trap. I rolled my Wildcat inverted and dove after the Zero that had just tried to kill me. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. The Japanese pilot was good, weaving his fighter through the sky like a silver dart, but I had altitude and speed on my side. More importantly, I had something to protect. 20,000 feet below us, the USS Yorktown cut through the Pacific swells at 25 knots, her flight deck bustling with activity as our remaining aircraft prepared for the next wave. Around her, the destroyers and cruisers of Task Force 17 maintained their defensive formation, their 5-inch guns scanning the skies for targets. From up here, they looked like toys floating in a bathtub, but they weren't toys. They were home, and every man aboard those ships was counting on us 6 Wildcat pilots to keep the Japanese dive bombers away from their steel decks. The problem was ammunition. We'd been fighting since dawn, and my ammunition counter showed just 47 rounds remaining for me. 50 caliber machine guns. 47 bullets to stop however many Japanese aircraft were still coming our way. I'd started the day with 1,440 rounds. Do the math. "Blue leader, this is Blue 4, crackled the voice of Ensign Tom Morrison over the radio. "I count 18 bogies coming in low from the northwest. Looks like Ricci dive bombers with Zero escort." I keyed my microphone while still chasing the Zero below me. "Copy, Blue 4. "What's your ammunition status?" 32 rounds, sir." My heart sank. Morrison was one of our best shots, and if he was down to 32 rounds, the others couldn't be much better off. I did a quick mental calculation. 6 fighters, maybe 200 rounds of ammunition total, against 18 incoming Japanese aircraft. Those weren't fighting odds. Those were suicide odds. But we'd been facing suicide odds all morning, and we were still flying. The Zero pilot below me suddenly pulled up in a desperate climbing turn, trying to get behind me. I'd been waiting for that move. I chopped my throttle and dropped my flaps, bleeding off speed like an air brake. The Japanese fighter shot past me, and for exactly 3 seconds, he was perfectly positioned in my gun sight. I squeezed the trigger. My 4 machine guns hammered out a short burst, maybe 10 rounds total. I watched the tracers arc through the sky and saw them sparkle against the Zero's engine cowling. White smoke began streaming from his aircraft immediately. The pilot tried to turn away, but it was too late. The engine seized, and the Zero began its final dive toward the Pacific. "Scratch 1-0, I reported, trying to keep the satisfaction out of my voice. That was my fourth kill of the day, but there was no time for celebration. The dive bombers were still coming. I pulled back on the stick and climbed toward the incoming formation. Below me, I could see the other 5 Wildcats of my flight, Blue 12 through Blue 6, positioning themselves for the intercept. These were good men, experienced pilots who'd been fighting in the Pacific since Pearl Harbor. Morrison had shot down 3 Japanese aircraft at Coral Sea. Lieutenant Bill Adams had 5 kills to his credit. Ensign Pete Wheeler was only 19 years old, but he flew like he'd been born in a cockpit. They were also flying aircraft that were supposed to be inferior to everything the Japanese had. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was slower than the Zero, couldn't turn as tight, and didn't climb as fast. What it could do was take punishment and keep flying. What it could do was dive like a brick and pull out of that dive when other aircraft would come apart. What it could do was mount 4 heavy machine guns that could turn a Japanese fighter into scrap metal with one good burst. But only if we had ammunition for those guns. "Blue Leader, I have visual on the bombers," reported Lieutenant Adams. "Looks like 18 Arichi 99s in 3 sections of 6. Zero escort is climbing to engage us." I could see them now. 18 dark specks growing larger against the blue sky, sunlight glinting off their canopies and wing surfaces. RHD-3 dive bombers, what we called VALs, each one carrying a 550-pound bomb intended for Yorktown's flight deck. Behind them, climbing fast to meet us, were at least a dozen Zero fighters. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 18 bombers could do tremendous damage to our task force. Even if we shot down half of them, the remaining 9 could potentially sink Yorktown and several escort vessels. The Japanese had already demonstrated their skill at Coral Sea and Pearl Harbor. These weren't training pilots. These were veterans who'd been perfecting their craft since the war began. But they'd never faced pilots who were defending a ship that had already died twice and refused to stay dead. At 1,200 yards, I opened fire on the lead Arichi. My tracers reached across the sky like orange fingers, converging on the dive bomber's engine cowling. The Japanese pilot tried to turn away, but his heavily loaded aircraft couldn't match my diving speed. My first burst caught the Arichi just behind the propeller. I could see pieces of metal spinning away in the slipstream, and black smoke began pouring from the engine immediately. The bomber dropped out of formation, its pilot probably fighting to maintain control as his aircraft lost power and altitude. But even as I pulled up from my attack, the Zeros were coming down to meet us. I saw one diving toward Morrison's Wildcat from high and behind, its guns already flickering with muzzle flashes. Morrison saw the threat and rolled his fighter into a steep climbing turn, but the Zero pilot was experienced and stayed with him. "Blue 4, break left," I shouted over the radio. Morrison snapped his Wildcat into a hard left turn just as the Zero's bullets reached his previous position. The evasive maneuver saved his life, but it also took him out of the fight against the dive bombers. That was the Japanese strategy. Use the Zeros to tie up our fighters while the dive bombers pressed home their attack. It was sound tactics, and it was working. I selected another target, an Arichi flying in the second section, and rolled into another attack. This pilot was more alert than the first one, and he began evasive maneuvers as soon as he saw me coming. The dive bomber weaved back and forth across the sky, making it almost impossible to get a clean shot. At 800 yards, I fired a short burst that missed completely. At 600 yards, I tried again, leading the target more carefully this time. My tracer sparkled against the Oichi's port wing, but the aircraft kept flying. I was closing too fast now, about to overshoot the bomber without inflicting serious damage. In another few seconds, I'd be past the Japanese formation entirely, with nothing to show for my attack except wasted ammunition. That's when I made a decision that still gives me nightmares 40 years later. Instead of pulling up and climbing away, I chopped my throttle and dropped my flaps, bleeding off speed so rapidly that the Wildcat shuddered on the edge of a stall. The maneuver put me directly behind the Arichi at point-blank range, maybe 200 yards, with a perfect shot at the bomber's engine and cockpit. It also made me a sitting duck for every Zero in the sky. I squeezed the trigger and held it down, pouring bullets into the dive bomber's fuselage. The Arichi came apart under the concentrated fire, its wing folding up like paper as the aircraft went into an uncontrollable spin. But before I could climb away, tracer bullets began snapping past my canopy from behind. A Zero had gotten on my tail during the attack, and his pilot was good, very good. I could feel his bullets hitting my aircraft, punching through the aluminum skin with sharp metallic impacts. The engine began running rough immediately. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone, and oil pressure started dropping. Whatever the Zero pilot had hit, it was something important. I rolled the Wildcat into a steep dive, trying to use my aircraft's superior diving speed to escape. But the Zero followed me down, its guns chattering almost continuously. More hits sparkled along my wings and fuselage. At 8,000 feet, my engine seized completely. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of constant engine noise. Without power, the Wildcat was just a very heavy glider, losing altitude at about 1,000 feet per minute. I had maybe 8 minutes before I hit the ocean. But 8 minutes was enough time to make one more attack. Below me, the formation of Japanese dive bombers was beginning their attack runs on Yorktown. I could see them pushing over into steep dives, building up speed for their bombing runs. In a few minutes, they'd be dropping their bombs on the carrier's flight deck, unless someone stopped them. I pushed the stick forward and dove after the nearest Arichi, using gravity instead of engine power to build up speed. The airspeed climbed rapidly, 200, 250, 300 miles per hour. At that speed, even a powerless Wildcat could catch a diving bomber. The Japanese pilot never saw me coming. I lined up my shot carefully, holding my fire until I was close enough to guarantee a hit. At 300 yards, I opened fire with everything I had left. My remaining ammunition, maybe 60 rounds, poured out in one continuous burst that lasted exactly 4 seconds. I watched my tracers slam into the Arichi's cockpit and engine area. The bomber's canopy disintegrated, and the aircraft immediately went out of control. But instead of pulling out of my dive, I stayed with the falling bomber. At 2,000 feet, I was close enough to see the rising sun painted on its wings. At 1,000 feet, I could see the bomb still hanging beneath its fuselage. At 500 feet, both aircraft hit the Pacific Ocean. The last thing I remembered was the tremendous impact as my Wildcat hit the water at over 300 miles per hour. Then everything went black. I woke up floating in the Pacific Ocean, held above the surface by my life jacket and wondering why I wasn't dead. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the water, and the sound of aircraft engines had faded to a distant murmur. My head felt like someone had hit it with a baseball bat, and there was blood on my flight suit from cuts I didn't remember getting. But I was alive, floating in the warm Pacific water about 3 miles from where Yorktown and her escorts were slowly disappearing over the horizon. A PBY Catalina flying boat found me just before sunset, its crew hauling me aboard with the kind of rough efficiency that comes from rescuing shot-down pilots all day long. As we flew back toward the task force, the radio operator filled me in on what had happened after I went down. The Japanese dive bomber attack had been largely unsuccessful. Out of 24 OHD-3, as that had pressed home their attack, only 3 had managed to hit Yorktown with their bombs. The carrier had taken serious damage, fires on the flight deck, casualties in the engineering spaces, but she was still afloat and still fighting. Our 8 Wildcats had accounted for 11 enemy aircraft destroyed and several more damaged before we were either shot down or forced to withdraw due to fuel exhaustion. Morrison had made it back to the carrier with 2 dead engines and bullet holes you could put your fist through. Wheeler had crash-landed on the flight deck but walked away from the wreckage. Lieutenant Adams, who I thought was dead after the morning engagement, had been picked up by a destroyer after floating in his life raft for 6 hours. He'd shot down 2 more Japanese aircraft before his ammunition ran out. But the real story wasn't what we'd accomplished in our Wildcats. The real story was what happened on Yorktown herself. Despite taking multiple bomb and torpedo hits, despite fires and flooding and casualties, The carrier's crew had kept her operational throughout the entire battle. Damage control parties had shored up bulkheads and pumped out flooded compartments. Engineering crews had jury-rigged repairs to keep the engines running. Flight deck crews had cleared wreckage and patched holes so that aircraft could continue landing and taking off. By the time the PBY delivered me back to the task force, Yorktown was making 25 knots and operating aircraft as if nothing had happened. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at her, over 100 aircraft in multiple coordinated attacks, and she was still fighting. It was, I realized, a perfect metaphor for America itself in 1942. We'd been hit hard at Pearl Harbor, bloodied in the Philippines and Wake Island, forced to retreat across the Pacific. But we hadn't quit fighting. We'd rebuilt our fleet, trained new pilots, and come back stronger than before. Yorktown was supposed to be dead. The Japanese had sunk her at Coral Sea, according to their intelligence reports. She was supposed to be at the bottom of the Pacific, not steaming at full speed through enemy waters with her flight deck full of operational aircraft. But she was here anyway, because her crew had refused to let her die. I spent that night in Yorktown's sick bay, getting my cut stitched up and my head examined for concussion. Through the porthole, I could see the lights of the other ships in our task force, maintaining their formation as they steamed through the darkness. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Our morning fighter sweeps had found the Japanese fleet, 4 aircraft carriers burning and dead in the water, victims of dive bombing attacks by our own squadrons from Enterprise and Hornet. The enemy was retreating toward Japan, leaving behind the wreckage of the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. We'd won. Against impossible odds, with inferior aircraft and limited resources, we'd defeated the best the Japanese Navy could throw at us. But the victory came with a price that became clear 2 days later. On June 6th, a Japanese submarine managed to penetrate our destroyer screen and put 2 torpedoes into Yorktown's port side. This time, the damage was too severe for even her magnificent crew to overcome. The carrier took on a severe list that couldn't be corrected, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. I was standing on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, watching through binoculars, when Yorktown finally rolled over and sank stern first into 3,000 fathoms of Pacific water. She went down with her battle flags flying, taking with her the memories of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Midway. But she also took with her something else, the myth of Japanese invincibility. The Imperial Navy had committed 4 fleet carriers and their best pilots to the attack on Midway. They'd lost all 4 carriers and most of their aircrew. It was a defeat from which they would never fully recover. As I watched Yorktown disappear beneath the waves, I thought about the men who'd served aboard her, the pilots who'd flown from her deck, the sailors who'd kept her engines running, the damage control parties who'd fought to save her time and again. They'd served on a ship that was supposed to be dead already, and they'd used her to help win the most important naval battle in American history. That's what Yorktown taught us, that it's not the ships or the aircraft that win battles. It's the men who serve aboard them. It's the willingness to keep fighting when everything looks hopeless. It's the refusal to quit, even when quitting would be the logical thing to do. 40 years later, I can still see the carrier settling into her final dive, her flight deck tilted at an impossible angle, her hull gleaming in the afternoon sun. She'd been hit by Japanese bombs and torpedoes at Coral Sea. She'd been patched up in 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. She'd been bombed and torpedoed again at Midway, and her crew had kept her fighting. In the end, it took a submarine attack when her defenses were down to finally sink her. Even then, she didn't go easily. Yorktown was supposed to be sunk, but her crew refused to let her go down. And in the process, they helped save the Pacific War for America. That's a lesson worth remembering, I think. In war, as in life, it's not about the hand you're dealt. It's about how you play the cards. We played ours pretty well at Midway. And Yorktown, old battle-damaged, patched-together Yorktown, showed us how it was done. She was the ship that refused to die, served by men who refused to quit. And in June of 1942, that made all the difference in the world. They never faced pilots who had something to prove. They'd never faced men who were flying a carrier that was supposed to be dead already, defending a fleet that represented America's last hope in the Pacific. I keyed my microphone one more time. Blue flight. This is Blue leader. We're going to hit the bombers first. Ignore the zeros unless they get in your way. Make every shot count. We don't have ammunition to waste. Roger, Blue leader. Copy that. Understood, sir. The responses came back crisp and professional, but I could hear the tension underneath. Every pilot in Blue flight knew what we were facing. Every pilot knew that after this engagement, we'd probably be out of ammunition and fuel, floating in life rafts while we waited for rescue. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today's problem was 18 Japanese dive bombers heading straight for the most important American naval force in the Pacific Theater. I pushed the throttle to the firewall and dove toward the enemy formation. My 5 wingmen spread out behind me in a loose combat formation. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 miles per hour, and the engine noise rose to a howl that vibrated through every rivet in the airframe. At 2,000 yards, I could make out individual details on the lead bomber. The red rising sun painted on its wings, the greenhouse canopy where the pilot and gunner sat, the bomb slung beneath the fuselage like a deadly egg waiting to hatch. The Japanese pilot saw us coming and began evasive maneuvers, but a loaded dive bomber couldn't match the speed of a diving fighter. I lined up my shot carefully, leading the target just enough to account for his forward motion. The gun sight reticle settled just ahead of the bomber's engine cowling. My finger tightened on the trigger. 1,500 yards. 1,800. At 600 yards, I opened fire. The 4.50 caliber machine guns mounted in my Wildcat's wings erupted with a sound like thunder. I could feel the aircraft shudder with each round fired, the recoil pushing against the engine's forward thrust. My tracers reached out across the sky like orange fingers, converging in the lead Oichi dive bomber. The Japanese pilot never knew what hit him. My first burst caught his aircraft just behind the engine, punching through the thin aluminum skin and into whatever lay beneath. I could see pieces of metal spinning away in the slipstream, glinting like confetti in the morning sun. The bomber's engine began trailing black smoke immediately, and the aircraft dropped out of formation like a wounded bird. "Nice shooting, Blue leader," came Morrison's voice over the radio. "I'm taking the number 2 bird." I pulled up sharply to avoid colliding with the bomber I'd just hit, feeling the G-forces press me deep into my seat. Below me, the damaged Oichi was spinning toward the ocean, its crew probably already dead from my machine gun fire. That was one less bomb heading for Yorktown's deck, but 17 more were still coming. I looked at my ammunition counter and felt my stomach drop. 29 rounds remaining. That burst had cost me almost 20 bullets, and I'd only knocked down 1 bomber. At this rate, I'd be out of ammunition before we'd stopped half the attack. The formation of Japanese dive bombers was breaking apart now as our 6 Wildcats tore into them like wolves attacking a flock of sheep. I could see Morrison's aircraft climbing after another Oichi, his guns already firing. Lieutenant Adams was diving on a bomber that had broken away from the main group, trying to escape toward a bank of clouds on the horizon. But the Zeros were coming down to meet us now, and everything was about to get much more complicated. The first Zero came screaming down at me from 11 o'clock high, its machine guns already flickering with muzzle flashes. I could see the red tracers reaching toward my aircraft like deadly fingers. I yanked the stick hard right and rolled me Wildcat into a spiraling dive, feeling bullets snap past the canopy so close I could hear them over the engine noise. The Japanese pilot followed me down, and I could see him in my mirror, a dark silhouette against the blue sky, his aircraft gaining on mine with every second. The Zero was faster in a straight line, and if I didn't do something quickly, he'd have me lined up for a killing shot. I remembered my training at Pensacola, the endless hours practicing aerial combat maneuvers over the Florida Panhandle. When you're being chased by a faster aircraft, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had told us, don't try to outrun him, outthink him. I waited until the Zero was almost in firing position, then chopped my throttle and pulled back on the stick as hard as I could. The Wildcat's nose came up like an elevator, and I felt the aircraft shudder on the edge of a stall. Behind me, the Japanese pilot shot past, his aircraft moving too fast to follow my sudden maneuver. Now it was my turn. I rolled inverted and dove after the Zero, pushing my engine to maximum power. The airspeed climbed rapidly, 250, 275, 300 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot saw me coming in his mirror and tried to turn away, but he'd made the same mistake his comrade had made earlier. You can't outturn a Wildcat in a power dive. I lined up my shot carefully, holding me fire until I was absolutely certain of a hit. With only 29 rounds left, I couldn't afford to miss. At 400 yards, I squeezed the trigger. This time, I fired only a 2-second burst, maybe 8 rounds total. But all 8 rounds found their target. I watched my tracers slam into the Zero's wing root, right where the fuel tank was located. The aircraft exploded instantly, turning into a ball of orange flame and black smoke that tumbled toward the ocean below. Scratch 1-0, I reported, but there was no satisfaction in my voice this time. 21 rounds left. The mathematics were getting worse by the minute. I looked around the sky, trying to assess the tactical situation. The neat formations we'd started with had dissolved into a sprawling dogfight scattered across 10 square miles of Pacific sky. Individual aircraft twisted and turned in deadly duels, leaving trails of smoke and flame behind them. Morrison was chasing an Arichi dive bomber in a climbing turn, his guns chattering in short bursts. I could see his tracers hitting the bomber's fuselage, but the aircraft kept flying. Japanese aircraft were tough, built to absorb punishment and keep going. Lieutenant Adams was in trouble. 2 Zeros had gotten behind his Wildcat, and I could see him weaving desperately through the sky, trying to avoid their concentrated fire. His aircraft was already trailing smoke from several hits. Blue 2, this is Blue Leader, I called over the radio. I'm coming to assist. Negative, Blue Leader, Adams replied, his voice tight with concentration. Stay with the bombers. I can handle these 2. Even as he said it, I could see more hits sparkling along his aircraft's wing. Adams was one of the best pilots in the squadron, but he was fighting 2 against 1 odds with an aircraft that was already damaged. I had to make a choice. Help Adams and let more bombers through to attack the fleet, or continue hunting the dive bombers and hope Adams could survive on his own. It was the kind of choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Copy, Blue 2, I replied, and turned away to chase another Aichi that was heading toward Yorktown. Behind me, I heard Adams' guns fire one more long burst. Then his radio went silent. I caught up with the Aichi at 8,000 feet, just as the pilot was beginning his attack dive on our task force. Below us, I could see Yorktown's flight deck clearly, the tiny figures of deck crews running to battle stations, the 5-inch gun mounts swinging toward the incoming bombers, the white wake streaming behind the carrier as she maneuvered to avoid the attack. The Japanese pilot pushed his aircraft into a near-vertical dive, building up speed for his bombing run. At terminal velocity, an Aichi D-3A could reach over 400 miles per hour in a dive, making it almost impossible to intercept once the attack began. But I'd caught this one before he'd built up full speed. I rolled my Wildcat inverted and followed him down, pulling my aircraft into the steepest dive I'd ever attempted. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 7,000 feet, 6,000, 5,000. The G-forces built up as I pulled harder on the stick, trying to match the bomber's descent angle. The Arichi pilot knew I was behind him. I could see his rear gunner swiveling his machine gun around, trying to get a shot at my aircraft. Muzzle flashes flickered from the bomber's rear cockpit, and I felt bullets hit my port wing. But I was closing the distance. 400 yards, 300, 200. At 100 yards, almost point-blank range, I opened fire with everything I had left. All 21 remaining rounds poured out of my machine guns in one continuous burst that lasted exactly 1.8 seconds. You watched my tracers reach across the sky and slam into the Aichi's engine and cockpit area. The bomber's canopy disintegrated under the concentrated fire, and I could see the pilot slump forward over his controls. The aircraft continued its dive, but now it was uncontrolled. Instead of pulling out to drop its bomb on Yorktown's deck, the Aichi kept going straight down, carrying its 550-pound bomb harmlessly into the Pacific. Blue Leader, ammunition expended. I reported over the radio, though it felt strange to say the words out loud. In 3 hours of combat, I'd gone from a fully armed fighter to a very expensive glider. "Copy, Blue Leader," came Morrison's voice. "I'm down to 6 rounds." Around the sky, the other surviving members of Blue Flight were reporting similar ammunition states. Ensign Wheeler was completely out. Lieutenant Adams wasn't reporting anything at all. But as I pulled out of my dive and looked around the battlefield, I realized something remarkable had happened. The sky that had been filled with Japanese aircraft just minutes before was now almost empty. Here and there I could see individual bombers limping away toward the northwest, trailing smoke and losing altitude. A few Zeros were climbing for altitude, probably planning to rejoin their carrier-based squadrons. But the main attack had been broken up. Out of 18 Arichi dive bombers that had threatened our task force, I could count only 4 or 5 that were still in fighting condition. The rest were either shot down or so badly damaged that they'd never make it back to their carriers. We'd done it. 6 Wildcat fighters with limited ammunition had turned back a major Japanese air attack. But the price had been high. As I orbited the task force at 3,000 feet, I could see only 4 other Wildcats in the sky. Blue 2, Lieutenant Adams, was missing. Blue 5, Ensign Bobby Patterson, was nowhere to be seen either. "Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader," I called over the radio. "Form up on me for landing. We're going home." The 4 surviving Wildcats joined up in a loose formation, and we began our approach to Yorktown's flight deck. As we flew closer, I could see the damage the carrier had sustained during the attack. Several small fires were burning on the flight deck where bombs or crashing aircraft had hit. Damage control parties were already working to clear the wreckage and prepare the deck for landing operations. But Yorktown was still afloat, still fighting, still launching and recovering aircraft like the floating airfield she'd been designed to be. As I lowered my landing gear and lined up for my approach, I thought about Lieutenant Adams and Ensign Patterson. Good men, experienced pilots, friends who'd shared countless hours in ready rooms and officers' clubs from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. Now they were gone, probably floating somewhere in the vast Pacific, waiting for rescue that might never come. But they died protecting something important. They died making sure that Yorktown, the carrier that was supposed to be at the bottom of the ocean already, could continue fighting for another day. I caught the number 3 arresting wire with a bone-jarring thump that threw me forward against my shoulder harness. The Wildcat rolled to a stop, and yellow-shirted deck crew members were already running toward my aircraft to guide me clear of the landing area. I shut down the engine and sat in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the shouts of deck crews preparing for the next recovery. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the aftermath of adrenaline. I'd been flying and fighting for over 4 hours, and every muscle in my body ached. A plane captain appeared at my wingtip and gave me the signal to climb out. I unstrapped my harness, pulled off my helmet, and climbed down from the cockpit onto Yorktown's steel deck. The air smelled of aviation fuel, cordite, and smoke. Damage control parties were still fighting fires in 3 different locations on the flight deck. But despite the chaos, despite the battle damage, despite everything the Japanese had thrown at us, the carrier was still operational. "Nice work up there, Lieutenant," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Commander Oscar Pedersen, Yorktown's Air Group commander, walking toward me with a clipboard in his hand. "Thank you, sir," I replied. "But we lost Blue 2 and Blue 5. Pedersen nodded grimly. "I know. But you and your flight just saved this task force. Intelligence estimates that Bomber Group could have put 15 to 20 bombs on target if they'd gotten through. Instead, they got maybe 2 or 3 hits, none of them critical." I looked around at the damage on the flight deck, the twisted metal, the scorch marks, the holes where Japanese bombs had found their mark. "This doesn't look like success." "Sir, it doesn't look like failure either," Pedersen replied. "And in this war, Lieutenant, not failing is sometimes the same thing as winning." He was right, of course. But as I walked toward the island structure for debriefing, I couldn't get the image of Lieutenant Adams smoking Wildcat out of my mind. Success in warfare always came with a price, and today that price had been paid by better men than me. What I didn't know yet was that our morning's work was just the beginning. The Japanese had committed 4 fleet carriers and over 250 aircraft to the attack on Midway. What we'd fought off was just the first wave. The real battle was still coming. The second attack came at 14:20 hours, just as we were finishing lunch in the wardroom. I was halfway through a plate of beans and franks when the ship's alarm started blaring, that distinctive rising and falling wail that meant enemy aircraft inbound. All hands, man your battle stations. All hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill. I dropped my fork and ran for the flight deck, along with every other pilot who wasn't already airborne. Through the portholes, I could see our combat air patrol, 6 fresh Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, climbing toward a formation of dark specks on the horizon. But this attack was different from the morning raid. These weren't just dive bombers with fighter escort. This was a coordinated strike by torpedo bombers and dive bombers, designed to hit Yorktown from 2 different directions at the same time. Torpedo bombers were the most dangerous threat any carrier could face. Unlike dive bombers, which attacked from high altitude and could be spotted miles away, torpedo bombers came in low and fast, skimming just above the wave tops until they were close enough to drop their deadly fish. A single torpedo hit below the waterline could cripple or sink a carrier. And according to the radar reports crackling over the ship's communication system, there were at least 12 of them heading our way. I reached the flight deck just as the first anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The 5-inch mounts on our escorting cruisers and destroyers were already hurling shells into the sky, creating black puffs of smoke that blossomed like deadly flowers against the blue afternoon sky. The sound was deafening, a constant crash of explosions that made the steel deck vibrate under my feet. "O'Hare!" shouted Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, pointing toward a Wildcat that was being pushed toward the launching position. "We need every fighter in the air." "Can you fly?" I looked at the aircraft, a different Wildcat from the one I'd flown that morning, this one carrying a full load of ammunition and fuel. After 4 hours of combat, the idea of climbing back into a cockpit should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Yes, sir." I ran toward the aircraft, grabbing a parachute and flight helmet from a rack near the island structure. The plane captain was already starting the engine as I climbed into the cockpit. Within 30 seconds, I was strapped in and ready for launch. "Wildcat 23, you're cleared for takeoff," came the voice of the air boss over the radio. I pushed the throttle forward and felt the familiar acceleration as the Wildcat rolled down Yorktown's flight deck. At the bow, I pulled back on the stick and lifted off into the controlled chaos of an aerial battle already in progress. The sky around the task force was filled with aircraft, American fighters climbing to intercept the incoming attack, Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers pressing home their assault, and the black bursts of anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the formation. It looked like the 4th of July and the end of the world rolled into one. "Any blue flight aircraft, this is home plate," came the voice of Yorktown's fighter director over the radio. "We have 12 torpedo bombers coming in from the west at low level. Vector 270 Angels 2. I turned toward the designated heading and pushed the throttle to maximum power. At 2,000 feet, I could see them clearly, 12 Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers, what we called Kates, flying in tight formation about 50 feet above the wave tops. Each aircraft carried a Type 91 torpedo slung beneath its fuselage, a weapon capable of blowing a hole the size of a house in a carrier's hull. The Kates were protected by at least 80 fighters, weaving back and forth above the torpedo bombers like shepherds protecting their flock. As I closed the distance, one of the Zeros peeled off to intercept me. This time, I had plenty of ammunition. The Zero pilot was aggressive, turning toward me head-on for a frontal attack. It was a dangerous tactic, 2 aircraft approaching each other at a combined speed of over 500 miles per hour, with maybe 3 seconds of firing time before they either collided or passed each other. I waited until the last possible moment, then pulled up slightly and opened fire. My 4 machine guns poured bullets into the Zero's engine and cockpit area. The Japanese fighter seemed to disintegrate under the concentrated fire, pieces spinning away in all directions. What was left of the aircraft flipped inverted and crashed into the Pacific in a shower of spray and debris. But while I was dealing with the Zero, the torpedo bombers had continued their approach. They were less than 2 miles from Yorktown now, beginning to spread out into attack formation. Once they dropped their torpedoes, the carrier would have maybe 90 seconds to maneuver before the weapons reached their target. and maneuvering a 20,000-ton aircraft carrier was like trying to change direction in a freight train. I dove toward the formation of Kates, lining up on the lead aircraft. The torpedo bomber was larger than the fighters I'd been engaging all day and slower, but it was also more heavily built. It would take more than a quick burst to bring one down. At 600 yards, I opened fire and held the trigger down for a full 3-second burst. My tracers reached across Thesky and slammed into the Kate's port wing and engine. The aircraft caught fire immediately, but kept flying. The pilot was trying to hold his aircraft steady long enough to drop his torpedo. I fired again, another long burst that exhausted nearly a third of my ammunition. This time, my bullets found the torpedo bomber's fuel tank. The Kate exploded in a ball of orange flame, taking its torpedo with it. But 11 more were still coming. Around me, the other Wildcats of the Combat Air Patrol were engaging the remaining torpedo bombers with everything they had. I could see Lieutenant Morrison, who'd survived the morning battle, diving on another Kate. Ensign Wheeler, flying his second mission of the day, was chasing a torpedo bomber that had broken away from the main formation. The problem was that there were more torpedo bombers than there were fighters to stop them. Simple arithmetic. 11 Kates versus maybe 8 Wildcats. Some of the torpedo bombers were going to get through. I selected another target, a Kate flying slightly behind the main formation, and dove to attack. This pilot saw me coming and began evasive maneuvers, jinxing left and right to throw off my aim. But a heavily loaded torpedo bomber couldn't maneuver like a fighter. At 400 yards, I had a clear shot. I fired a short burst, maybe 20 rounds, that caught thicket just behind the cockpit. The aircraft didn't explode this time, but I could see the pilot slump forward over his controls. The torpedo bomber went into a gentle dive and hit the ocean about a mile short of the American formation. But the remaining Kates were getting very close now. I could see Yorktown ahead of them, her flight deck dark against the blue-green water, white wake streaming behind her as she maneuvered at maximum speed. Around the carrier, the escort vessels were throwing up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire so intense it looked like a steel rain. 3 torpedo bombers broke through the defensive fire and began their final attack runs. I watched them drop their torpedoes almost simultaneously, 3 white splashes as the weapons hit the water and began their deadly run toward Yorktown's port side. "Torpedoes in the water," someone shouted over the radio. 3 fish running hot, straight, and normal. From my position 3,000 feet above the action, I could see the white wakes of the torpedoes as they raced toward the carrier. Yorktown's captain was doing everything possible to avoid them, turning hard to starboard, increasing speed, presenting the smallest possible target profile. But aircraft carriers are big targets, and torpedoes are designed to hit big targets. The first torpedo missed astern by maybe 50 yards. The second torpedo missed ahead by an even smaller margin. But the third torpedo, launched by the Kate I'd damaged but failed to stop, was running true. I watched helplessly as the white wake intersected with Yorktown's hull amidships, just below the waterline. The explosion, when it came, was enormous, a column of water and debris that shot up higher than the carrier's flight deck. The entire ship shuddered from the impact, and I could see her list immediately to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the torpedo hole. For a moment, I thought we'd lost her. The list continued to increase, and I could see tiny figures, Yorktown's crew, running across the canted flight deck toward the high side of the ship. Steam was rising from the engineering spaces, and the carrier's speed dropped noticeably. But then something remarkable happened. The list stabilized at about 7 degrees and stopped getting worse. Emergency repair parties were already working below decks, shoring up bulkheads and pumping out flooded compartments. Yorktown's damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich, had trained his men well. Within 20 minutes, the carrier was back to an even keel and making 20 knots. The flight deck was operational again, and aircraft were landing and taking off as if nothing had happened. It was an incredible display of seamanship and damage control. Any other carrier might have been out of action for hours, if not permanently. But Yorktown's crew had refused to let their ship die. The Japanese, watching from their own aircraft, must have thought they were seeing ghosts. They'd torpedoed this carrier at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month earlier. They'd just torpedoed her again, and yet she kept fighting. But the Japanese weren't finished with us yet. Even as our fighters were chasing off the last of the torpedo bombers, radar was picking up another formation approaching from the northeast. This time it was dive bombers, Aichi-D3, as coming in at high altitude for a vertical attack on Yorktown's flight deck. I looked at my fuel gauge and ammunition counter. Half fuel, maybe 200 rounds remaining. Enough for one more engagement, if I was careful. All fighters, came the voice of the fighter director over the radio. Large formation of dive bombers approaching from the northeast, range 40 miles. Vector 045, Angels 15. I pushed the throttle forward and began climbing toward 15,000 feet. Around me, the other surviving Wildcats were doing the same thing. 8 fighters against what looked like another 20-plus Japanese aircraft. But we'd been fighting impossible odds all day. What was one more engagement? As I climbed through 10,000 feet, I keyed my microphone one last time. This is Blue Leader to all Blue flight aircraft. We've come this far, gentlemen. Let's finish the job. The responses came back immediately, crisp and professional despite everything we'd been through. Blue 4, roger. Blue 6, copy. Blue 7, understood. Good men, all of them. Tired, running low on fuel and ammunition, flying aircraft that had been patched and repatched since the morning, but still willing to climb into the sky one more time to protect the fleet below. Because that's what we did. That's what we'd signed up for when we pinned on our wings and swore our oath as naval aviators. We climbed toward the enemy, and we prepared to fight. At 15,000 feet, the formation of Japanese dive bombers looked like a flock of deadly birds against the afternoon sky. I counted them carefully, 24 Aichi-D3, as in tight 3-plane sections, with at least a dozen Zero fighters weaving back and forth above them for protection. 36 aircraft total, all headed for Yorktown's flight deck. 8 American Wildcats against 36 Japanese aircraft. The mathematics hadn't improved since morning. Blue Leader, this is home plate, came the voice of Yorktown's fighter director over the radio. Be advised, we're launching additional fighters in 5 minutes. Can you delay the enemy formation? Delay them. As if 8 fighters could hold up 36 aircraft for any meaningful length of time. But I keyed my microphone anyway. Copy, home plate. We'll do what we can. What we could do was make the Japanese pay for every mile they flew toward our task force. What we could do was force them to fight their way through us instead of making an unopposed attack run. What we could do was buy Yorktown a few more minutes to prepare her defenses. Blue Flight, this is Blue Leader, I called over the radio. We're going to hit the dive bombers first, just like this morning. Ignore the Zeros unless they force an engagement. Make every shot count. I rolled my Wildcat inverted and dove toward the lead section of Aichi dive bombers. The airspeed climbed rapidly as I pulled back on the stick, 250, 275, 300 miles per hour. At this speed, the Wildcat was faster than anything the Japanese had, but I could only maintain it for a few minutes before the engine overheated. The Japanese formation was still in tight order, the dive bombers flying in neat V formations that would allow them to attack Yorktown from multiple angles simultaneously. It was a well-coordinated strike, the kind of attack that Japanese naval aviators had been practicing since before the war began, but they